Okay, share my screen.
I'm posting a link to the paper in the chat. I'm not sure if everyone was able to see the first. It depends on it when you enter.
Okay, thanks, Adam. All right, so I really just want to thank everybody for coming today to a project that's really been dear to Flavio and Adam and I. We've been working on this for a few years, and it really was one of the most emergent projects I've ever done. Before I talk a little about it, though, I wanted to just highlight the structure of this session. For those of you who went to my session yesterday, I really am wanting to be purposeful about this virtual space we're in and actually, spend time talking to each other. I think instead of doing a traditional slide and talk where you listen to us talk the whole time, I really want to hear your thoughts on these topics and kind of the big question of how your work kind of comes into this. So we'll definitely break out into groups. So going back to what I initially said, this was a project that literally, I guess I should say, I canoed into. As a new scholar at University of Texas, I wasn't really familiar with some of the debates in the learning sciences and happened to join a canoeing team. Flavio introduced to me this long debate in the learning sciences between, well, I'm going to butcher this, but in the really shorthand, cognition and action, and what drives action. And Lucy Suchman, in her really phenomenal book, Planned Situated Action, created this imaginary case of thinking about planning. And I'm just going to read this quote verbatim. In planning to run a series of rapids in a canoe, one is very likely to seat for a while above the falls and plan one's descent. A great deal of deliberation, discussion, simulation, and reconstruction may go into such a plan, but however detailed, the plans stop short of getting your canoe through the falls. And so she used this imaginary case to really talk about the limitations of planning and I guess at the time, computational models of the brain. And so the funny thing was, though, is that no social scientist, learning scientist ever took the time to actually figure out this is true. And being a new doctoral student, it's like, oh, well, I'm in a canoeing club. We run whitewater rapids all the time. Let's take this idea and run it to its limits. And so Flavio, Adam, and I came up with a set of questions, going from broad to more specific about studying planning from this learning sciences perspective, about maybe, synthesizing the two perspectives like Suchman did back in the day, but also this imaginary case she brought up about this reading and running a rapid or planning for a rapid. And then more importantly, towards the last two questions, can we even find the plan in the action? Does the plan even show up? And I know I'm kind of butchering this, but I want to go quickly so we can talk about these things. And so I think the funny thing in Suchman's case is that she didn't really talk about all the rapid running canoers do without even planning. And canoers, we call this reading and running. We're both simultaneously reading the water in front of us and just paddling, just kind of winging it. And we do this with a lot of rapids because in some cases it's fun. In some other ways, we feel like our embodied skills can hold up to it. And so I'm going to do the classic. There's more details in the paper, but knowing from my ethnographic experience of what this looks like. And on the bottom here, we just list some of these theoretical terms that we began thinking with when we were parsing through the video data. I'll spend some more time on that later on the actual terms, but I want to kind of speed up to this actual case that that Suchman tries to talk about in her imaginary case. This idea of when you approach a rapid, how do you scout and plan for it? And so canoers, we don't call it planning, we call it scouting. And what we'll do is we'll get out of our canoes and we'll park them upstream of the rapid. We'll get out and kind of imagine our what we call lines through the rapid, trying to imagine a path of us floating down and thinking of the different movements we make. We may do this based on certain targets or landmarks. We may draw on certain techniques or modes. But most importantly, we try to make sure we hit the correct end state, right? The end state for us, to draw on computational lingo back during sessions times, is to arrive somewhere safely down the rapid, preferably in one piece. So the plan is always oriented towards that. And so in this case that I show in this conference paper, this scouting takes like 22 minutes. And a great deal of deliberation goes into, thinking of these lines and talking to each other and trying to coordinate and imagine activity as they're walking up and down the side of the rapid. The funny thing though is that the rapid run only takes 2 minutes. And so all this work and deliberation goes into making this plan, but we only see very few of these planning elements in the actual run. In this case, the canoeer kind of at the very beginning talks about, we got to make sure we hit our certain technique, we got to be by certain landmarks. But the funny thing is, they don't do their actual plan anyway. So they completely miss the actual line. So this dashed line is what they wanted to do. This full line is their actual line that they took down the rapid. But I think the session's point is that they reach the end state anyway, alive and happy and mostly okay. And so it becomes this conversation of, not only finding plans in action, but between canoers, how their own embodied skills and coordination between each other helps, kind of round out how we theorize how people go about action. And so I know that was really fast, purposely fast, but I now want to spend some time letting you kind of talk about how you've kind of thought about whether planning or activity and how you kind of, situate the two. And just at a very basic level, introduce yourself. This is a great time to network and know each other. Talk a little bit about what brought you to the session, and then feel free to kind of talk about planning and human planning and situated action. And after we do the breakout group, we'll come back together and kind of talk about the big ideas from everyone. Is that?
And I'm personally planning on jumping from breakout room to breakout room. So if that's okay with other participants.
Evan, will you put that in the chat?
Yeah, the questions. Yeah, that would be good.
I'll have to. Zoom does this dumb thing where every breakout room chat has their own chat. So
yeah, but if you do it before we're in the breakout rooms, it'll all be in our chats.
Perfect. Okay.
Sherry, Seth, and I all work together on the same project where we've been thinking about these planning versus emergence in the context of science, but maybe don't put us all in the same the same breakout room.
And now I'm thinking about it, there's 10 of us. We could just do it this way. It seems small enough. We can have let's just have a conversation this way. We can be a little more, as you can tell, I really love emergent things. So I don't over plan things.
So
one thing I was thinking about, oh, sorry.
No, go for it. Floor is open.
One thing I was thinking about as you were talking is maybe the differences that you would see if you were looking at rock climbing was the example I was thinking about, because often, like, especially in bouldering, you like boulder a little bit and then you get off and you try it again, and how maybe like this ability to try and retry something like many times. I don't do rafting, so I don't know if you like, do people typically do something multiple times, and does that kind of affect the nature of planning or need, or even culture around planning or something maybe?
Yeah, we talked about that a lot in analysis. What made this context unique. One of the things is it's linear. There's a top and a bottom, and you go from top to bottom, and you don't go backwards. You never go backwards. You can't go backwards. Yeah. And so those are some constraints that you have for designing and using plans.
Yeah.
Rock climbing, yeah, you can climb down and try again.
Yeah, or fall off and try again, more likely.
I think that brings up a pretty cool connection to new things, right? Like maybe Lauren wants to talk some about this, and this links to mobility, right? And this one directional mobility that is characteristic of the context that we studied. But if you're planning a route within a city or within a country, then it's a different thing. Mm-hmm. So I really like that line of analysis where you compare and contrast it to other contexts of planning, and we can learn so much from that.
Yeah, one of the goals of this was kind of to kickstart that conversation of planning. I know Flavio likes to call it regimes of planning. Like what other regimes of mobility and planning, and what shapes that, right? Like in rapid running, it's a one-shot deal. I mean, the risk is pretty low. You won't, get like a major injury. It's fun, it's exciting, but you really can't go back and, do it again unless you do that trip another weekend. But a common, like other regimes, from Hutchins' flight plans to lesson plans, right, to teaching, right? How are these different contexts of planning might change how we create these plans and use them?
So I'd be interested. Oh, go ahead, Sherry.
I was gonna say, I'm just gonna introduce myself because I don't know everyone on the phone. But I'm Sherry Shee. I'm dialing in from the West Coast here, from the Concord Consortium West, the home office of Berkeley. And earlier this conference, someone had asked us to fill out a survey of where you situate yourself. And I feel like I'm 1/3 part designer, 1/3 part STEM researcher, and 1/3 part learning scientist. And thinking about this planning, because I spend a lot of time as a PI planning out these projects, and we go into the classroom, and in engineering, we talk about reframing the problem, because the question that you really wanted to study gets reformulated because it's so situated, because everything changes, right? The teacher changes. And so you have to be very dynamic and have this. So as you were talking, Kevin, I was thinking about these principles, like a principle of optimism, right? Or this principle of, flexibility or adapting, being adaptive in some way in order to account for kind of the changing situations, and being able to quickly kind of reframe what a goal might be. So it becomes a local goal, and kind of giving up a little control over what the global goal would be. Because I've had a lot of experience, saying this is the research question we want to go in with, and we know it's a design conjecture, and we know we're in iteration 1 or 2 or 3, and it's going to change. But still, at the end of this, it's still, it's kind of fun, but it's a fun surprise that happens.
So in that spirit, I'll just introduce myself, because I don't know very many of you either. My name is Kate Chapman. I'm also calling in from the West Coast, although I'm currently a doc student at Vanderbilt. So I'm just back home temporarily. I think of myself kind of the same split you just suggested. So where I come from is I am studying learning sciences because I was working in an informal space, teaching kids to sail and to paddle canoes and that kind of thing. Oh. And then they also are pushing what the connections to STEM are in that space. So I found myself having a really hard time planning how to lead those field trips, because I didn't have any sense of like what the right way to do that was. And graduate school has convinced me that nobody has a sense of what the right way to do that is. So my dissertation work right now, I'm looking at whether the physics behind how a sailboat works ever becomes relevant to kids who are simultaneously learning to sail. So we have a summer camp where in the morning they talk about the physics of what's going on, and then in the afternoon they learn how to sail. And unsurprisingly, probably for 5th graders, they just don't see any connection between the two. So I'm really curious what we could do to facilitate that kind of connection, but also does the sort of chalk talk that the sailing instructors give, where they say really specifically, when you're going to jibe, you put your tiller in this direction, or when they give you euphemisms like tiller towards trouble, which is what they tell the kids so that they can hopefully avoid hitting things. What are those chalk talks and those mnemonics to the development of a deeper understanding of STEM, which might theoretically give you a better ability to adapt as a like more advanced sailor? And how do those all sit on this continuum of what is planning, like how abstract can we get and still consider it to be part of what ends up happening in the embodied experience?
Hmm.
So should we move so that the next person can introduce herself? Is that okay? And then we go back to the questions. That's really cool.
Those are
Thank
great
you.
questions.
Yeah. Lauren, Mike, Marika, Seth, one of you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'll go. So I am one of Kate's peers at Vanderbilt. I'm also a doc student, or doctoral candidate. That's a new term for me. And let's see, my dissertation is focusing on how groups of people moving and dancing together can explore mathematics phenomena, and I co-design and work with professional dancers. But I think one of the things that your talk today, Kevin, Flavio, and Adam really brought up for me is you could like interpret the story you told about canoeing as like, well, it doesn't make sense to plan. Like, why would you even plan if it's all about improvisation? Like, what does planning have to do with any of this? But people are consistently planning. And so like, my question is, what is planning doing and how does that relate to improvisation? Because I think a lot about in working as a dancer and in working with dancers, sort of improvisation and in the moment physical reasoning. And they do some planning too, and they do some talk that's not actually in the moment, because one of the difficult things in doing, at least what I study, ensemble coordinated movements, or in your case, like in one directional going down a raft, is that you can't reanimate things, or like the act of trying to reanimate things or bringing the corporeal back into place becomes like a really complicated task for groups of people to do. And so I wonder, like, what is the role of planning and how is it supporting their reasoning? Because they're not dropping it. Even if they don't do what they plan, it's still there.
Yeah, just I want to pick up on that. That was the other thing I wanted to say I liked about your talk, is that there's a really interesting component that's implicit in what you were saying, which is planning is doing something really important for coordinating the embodied understanding of multiple people. So what does planning look like if I'm sailing single-handedly, and what does it look like if there are two people in the boat and neither of them know what they're doing? And like, obviously, it's a different collective experience, and possibly more necessary if what you need to do is to make sure this guy behind me doesn't mess it all up.
Yeah. And I think that is like, from a dance perspective, like that is the reason to even choreograph something or to engage in a process of choreography, is because you can't come into the studio with the whole plan. Like the ingenuity of humans' physicality is like what inspires the work. So the dancers I work with, the practice they call what they do is physical research. That's what they call their practice. And like the choreographer comes in with ideas or prompts, but if like I think constantly about my choreographer mentor in college, and she said, like, if you already knew what it was going to look like, why are you even doing it? Like, what's the point? If you already knew coming into the room like what it was going to look like, what are you learning from this process? And so there's this relation between like plans as seeds or scaffolds or support and something. And yeah, so I should probably popcorn to someone else. I'm gonna popcorn to Seth.
Okay, hi everybody, I'm Seth. I work with Lisa and Sherry at the Concord Consortium, also on the West Coast. I'm in Oakland, California. Let's see, I don't think I can put myself in a bucket yet. I'm very early in my career. I just finished undergrad last year, not in a grad program. So I don't want to label myself quite yet. But as far as planning goes, I think it's interesting thinking about it in like a classroom implementation standpoint. Like recently at Concord, we just did a implementation in January, and a lot of planning went into that. But I mean, immediately within the first period, we're already veered off course. Our time has changed, our schedules have changed. And what we expected the teacher to do and what the teacher wanted to do just all immediately changed. So I think adapting to plans, planning on the go, that sort of stuff is interesting ideas to think about. Yeah.
right, let's popcorn the someone else.
I can jump in. My name is Marijke. I tried to phoneticize it for everyone. I just finished my dissertation and graduated, which is very exciting. Yes, it is possible. The future is possible. And I appreciate what you said, Seth, about struggling to put yourself in buckets. I've done a lot of different things. I'm not sure how to bucketize them. I studied learning sciences. I've done a lot of outdoor environmental education as a practitioner. I consider myself an urban naturalist and look a lot at learning ecologies in my dissertation. And one of the things that I did for my dissertation, which relates to our conversation here, is I studied an informal outdoor summer program in an urban park, and I was looking particularly at these relational processes between the youth, the educators, and the natural environment, the non-human natural world. And we did these daily debriefs with the educators, and one of the things they began to talk about a lot, because they're doing environmental education, is they're kind of drawing from environmental metaphors. They talked about their practice as being one of adaptive management, which I think is very relevant for this conversation. And to Lauren's question that she put out, which I like, about like how does planning and improvisation relate? They saw their role as this effort to create enough structure that, you know, they had some idea what was happening with the day, but also enough fluidity that they could be responsive. And in this case, they were very attentive to being responsive both to the youth and also to what was happening in the landscape, because it's outdoor environmental ed, which is also something that would be happening on a canoe trip, or when you're sailing, you're having to respond to these other physical elements. So adaptive management is where we landed with that particular infrastructure, we called it. And I will popcorn. Who has not gone? Lisa, you haven't gone yet, have you?
No, I haven't. Hi, I'm Lisa. I work at the Concord Consortium with Sherry and Chef, which is Sherry and Seth. It's hard to say. So we work on a STEM plus C project, and we're looking at students learning in biology classes with sensors and software. But we have spent a bunch of time thinking about kind of the nature of planning, like in the sense of like what teachers try to get students to do before they do an experiment, before they go into the physical world and they mess around with things and they see what happens. And so we've been trying to just understand like this sort of emergent goals that kind of come up as people do get to interact with the material world, with technologies and equipment, and to try and figure out how we can like reform laboratory work that students do from something that's kind of well planned out in advance to something where emergence and tied to sort of like the sense of resistance from the material world or resistance from tools can create opportunities for students to learn. We're also like I would be interested in hearing what Flavio thinks about this, because we're also kind of thinking about this in terms of conditions of practice that students might have sort of preferences for, or at least repertoires of practice that sort of intersect with, where maybe what really transfers, you know, from these other prior experiences that they have to these science classrooms isn't their knowledge like about anything in particular, but maybe it's more important to look at like experiences with particular like socio-technical configurations. Like I have worked with a peer to improve a design of something, or used an instructions manual with a mentor. You know, so things like this. Like we're trying to look at these sorts of aspects of planning and activity in science classes.
Yeah, I can relate to that focus on kind of classroom planning of design, of research and stuff. I think that's really interesting. I've been working on a class lately where we teach the research process through writing, and we emphasize the use of an abstract up front for just kind of a way of imagining what might happen and structuring the way that you plan. But then you rewrite it and revise as you go. But typically in scientific writing, you teach the abstract at the end. But here we're using it as kind of like a planning device.
I think we got one person who hasn't gone yet. Megan, would you be interested?
And a new person who just joined.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Goki. I work at the Science Museum of Minnesota, actually, in the research department, and I'll be starting a graduate program in the fall. So like some others on the call, I don't have a bucket for myself yet, but what really attracted me to this session was kind of the expansive thinking of where does learning occur and having that not just very designed spaces, such as a museum or a formal classroom.
Where are you going to grad school?
I'll be starting at the University of Minnesota.
Okay. Well, we can go a little more freeform now. I'm actually interested in, Flavio, your answer to Lisa's question, if I can put you on the spot.
Yeah, I don't think I have one. I'd have to think a little bit more. Couple of things occurred to me regarding other things that I heard. And so I'm gonna try to be closer to the things that I think I heard most people talking about. We don't mean to say that the plan has no function, it doesn't appear in the action. Right? It's sometimes, and we see how the plan, we have a bigger paper where we flesh these things out in much better, in more detail. But yeah, the plan does have a function and you know, but there are many more functions, I think. So if you ask canoers, they just like to hang out and plan, even if they know that the plan is not going to be executed to the dot, because it's just fun. So that we tend to tell these stories that are about learning, right? But that goes back to lines of practice, right? We tend to tell these stories about learning, and we're trying to see learning all the time as the motivator. Or in this particular case, it's just the fun of doing the planning, of actually climbing here and climbing there. Right, and I think that Kevin can tell us a lot of these stories about, you know, how much fun it is to just plan the canoeing of rapids, right? The same may not be true, for instance, in Lisa's context, right? So thinking about contexts of planning in this more fine-grained, the detail is critical for, again, the other thing that I think that Lauren raised, which was, you know, the relationship between planning and improv. Right? Those are hard questions, right? So we fleshed some of that out, and I think, and it had a lot to do with the fact that they rely so much on their own team coordination across canoes and also within the canoeing dyad, right? That they know that they can rely on that part of the improv. So there's this shared understanding that pervades the community, right? Which I would assume is always the case, is also the case with Lauren's empirical space, right? Where they really know how to improv. My sister is a good dancer, and a lot of it comes out of like how the partner swirls her, and she can't describe it. And that stuff is like, oh, okay. It really resides in the body, right? I don't know how she reads the signs and so on, but there's all of that I would, if I were studying improv more closely, I would be interested in documenting all of these shared understandings and communications and so on. So yeah, and the planning on the go as well, we found that a lot, right? So even though it's a fast, so again, back to regimes of planning, even though it's a fast route down, way down, sometimes they will read things ahead and they will communicate, and so we call those executive planning. Because it has to do with like the things that you must do in the moment, and it has to be decided among two people. Does that happen in other contexts of planning? Maybe, maybe not. And I find it, again, really cool how all of us are entering this planning thing from different angles. my comment to Kate would be something like, you know, how to the connection between sailing and learning STEM and how the kids care or do not care for the physics. I was going to suggest that you break the keel. You know, break the structure, the physical.
Yeah, you just pull the dagger board out. Yeah.
Exactly, I remember. You can do that, and then tell them, you know, now do you believe physics has anything to do with how your boat is moving? And then, you know, go introducing it. But that's kind of like the instructional designers that all of us who are in right now here can do and think about, right?
It's
but
actually.
Shut up.
Oh no. So that while you were talking, I was thinking about exactly that. And there's a really great connection. I'm looking back at your questions and the one about how do you study planning from a learning sciences perspective. I really appreciated what you guys were saying about it's not that the plan doesn't show up in the execution. And I think there's a really important thing that I'm trying to think about how to describe the learning that's happening. And everybody always wants to say, so one of the things I've done is I've given the kids GoPro cameras that look down onto the boat and they have the GPS tracing. So one of the things that everyone at ICLS last year was inclined to say was, well, you can see they're learning because you told them to go from here to there. And over time, they were going like this and now they're going like this. So it looks like learning because now they are executing the plan more explicitly. But I want to stay really far away from that actually, because there's so much evidence of expertise that is happening when you stop executing the plan. And when you actually watch the video, like, oh no, some of that squiggly line was because they said, oh, you know what? I think we can go get that water bottle that someone just dropped. And like the squiggly line is them actually trying new things. So you're making me think about how some of the planning can be about trying on new things, like learning a new thing, but also it's about unlearning some routine that was already there. We never don't have some routine that we're acting on. And when we're trying to learn something new, we are as much modifying an old routine as we are taking on a new one. So the paper that I have here somewhere, I don't know, it's lost in the proceedings, but the paper that I'm trying to write right now is about using the GPS video and trying to get them to reflect on that as an intermediary between the two things. Like, is it worth it to you to look at this record of what happened and to talk about what that might illuminate for you and how that might actually help you the next time you want to go out in the boat, which is like when you get that feedback loop and that kind of dialectic, if you will, happening, then the STEM suddenly becomes actually possibly relevant to the sailing. Whereas otherwise, like they just want the really practical, like, where do I put my hand?
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think of I keep calling it the bicycling paper. It's not, I forget the actual name of the paper, but where they go bicycling around Nashville and, you know, look at that mapping data and reflect.
Katie Taylor's work.
Katie Taylor, yeah. So the funny thing is, like, we actually tried some shorthand version of that with this group. Because they already have GPS watches and GoPros, so we ran a few rapids, and later at camp, I actually like, hey, look, I can play some of this GoPro video for you if you want to, like, and I'll record you watching the video and reflecting about how you thought it actually went. And gosh, it was awkward. Like it didn't really work with this community. It didn't really listen to much feedback or conversation. They're like, oh yeah, whatever. That's like, it happens, you know. Because I think within this culture of canoeing, it's just bumps and going off course. It's just all part of the game. So it's just not. It wasn't very elucidating for them. They thought it was a really cool video, but it wasn't like it didn't really draw anything further. And not only that, it was hard to set up given literally we're like camping on the banks of a river. So it just trying to go that more like clinical interviewing route was just really tough with this project. But I definitely support anybody who was going to attempt that, because I think that was very much at the limits of this project. We were trying to go, more into their heads about, how they were imagining these lines, how they're reflecting about these lines. But yeah, I'll just put it there. It's something that we started theorizing at, but we kind of had to stop around there.
I mean, you were trying to do it while they were there, as opposed to doing some sort of agreed upon video and then calling them in later and having them reflect as they were watching themselves, maybe.
Yeah, our research idea was like, okay, we could just, if they canoe in the morning and watch the video at night, that's perfect. That's as close as we can get to them, thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we could have done it like a week or a few days later. It's just, it also became, and this is something we kind of talked about this morning in the video ethics symposium. As my role as an ethnographer, I really try not to insert a lot of my own self or events on this community. And it really became, I guess for me, like they were already filming and videotaping and GoProing that it was easy for me to slide in. But once I started saying like, hey, let's make this new event where we're gonna have a video watch party, I just felt like I was kind of breaching some weird cultural line. So I kind of stopped. But yeah, those are all things I keep thinking about for like the next project or for anybody else's projects that, that can incorporate that finer level of detail and questions.
I've been talking a lot, so I don't want to dominate, but I'll say one thing. I was very clearly not asking them to reflect on their own sailing. I actually asked them a much bigger question, which was, can you look at what you were doing here and where the boat went and tell me where the wind was coming from?
Mm.
So I was asking them to think about like, okay, that we know that knowing where the wind is coming from is absolutely instrumental to being able to sail, and that these kids have no idea. Like they just have zero concept of it. So I was like, okay, if you can't figure it out yet by doing the turn your face and feel the wind kind of thing, can you like reason back to it based on what was happening? So I don't know if that helps your work at all, but like it definitely wasn't a clinical interview. It was, okay, well, we do the sailing in the afternoon. Now we're in the morning boring science part. What if I show you GPS video? Does this make science fun? And then they were way more into it.
No, that is helpful. And I think to give you context of this study, that these are canoers canoeing to do citizen science. So there's a whole other citizen science piece that I didn't even talk about. So it's a lot to think about. And I really like this. I mean, thanks for this group. This is really interesting to see, looking across studies about how many of us are thinking about GoPros and mobility and planning. And I don't know, it's even lesson planning. Like I know I don't really use my lesson plan, but I do it every time anyway. And it's just like a funny conversation about what actually gets used and what doesn't. But the fact is that I think we're just starting, right? We're just starting these type of conversations. So it's really cool to see the different ways we're approaching it.
Yeah. I said Sherry just had to go, but I was just going to say, as somebody who also works on kind of like program planning and program implementation stuff, and have been for longer than I've been working on definitely canoe planning. Through this analytical process, I was always kind of jumping back and forth trying to draw some comparisons. And one of the things that I enjoyed about this analytical process was the way that it emphasized planning as a distributed material activity. The whole ecology is filled with plan elements that we are collaboratively surfacing discursively and then linking together in new constructs that can potentially guide action. At the same time, we've got all of these other things that exist in the environment that are there historically, these like routine practices and norms of practices and embodied knowledge of canoeing. And from a kind of a program planning perspective, I'm just struck by how little we pay attention to that stuff in a lot of program planning that we do. And you know, there's some new work coming, like I'm thinking of like Bill Penuel's paper on like infrastructuring through design-based research and co-design and stuff like that, and how they really, in that paper, they really emphasize taking this very kind of socio-technical approach and building routines and practices and infrastructures that support change making and stuff. And it you know, it strikes me like, you know, what are the embodied practices of program implementation? You know, like especially, you know, there are some, because we're all on Zoom now, which changes our day-to-day practices, you know, and we couldn't have planned for that, but now that we must, you know, how do we adapt? It's interesting.
Yeah, this idea about infrastructures in that paper you just brought up, Adam, was super helpful for me as I was looking at these educator practices that we called infrastructures. And some of the things that they did that I think were most effective were kind of setting the conditions for learning opportunities rather than directing the learning opportunity, if that makes sense. Yeah. So like a really simple example of this was a very rich library that started to develop over time. They didn't have a set number of books or types of books that they were going to include. We just started adding things as youth would ask questions about stuff, and the library just grew and grew. And then youth would like go to the library. I mean, it was just a bookshelf in the room that we met in when we had downtime, and they would just start like picking through these field guides, and that was a kind of a very loose infrastructure that is a routine of sorts. But I think like the word routine sometimes implies like action steps. But this was more like a set of physical objects that were available to draw on, which proved to be super effective for kids.
Oh, we lost you. We can't quite hear you.
Oh, sorry. I think I'm good.
Yeah, I like that. The like conditions for learning emergence rather than prescribing what they should learn and know. Yeah.
My ex-advisor would say, Flavio, design always so that you can be surprised. Design so that your students can always surprise you, right? Provide those material infrastructures, those rich activities that, you know, they can make whatever they want out of it, and you'll see real learning happening. You know, are schools about that? So others who haven't talked much, we want to hear from you. If, again, not to put anybody on the spot, but feel free to jump in.
So I was kind of thinking about, or one of the things I was thinking about is, I was trying to understand like what the space is of these different activities between like dance or canoeing or sailing or rock climbing or parkour or something like that. Like these different things that people do. What are the sort of parameters of this space, or like, how are you thinking about different activities in terms of like this sort of interaction that people have with the material world, or, you know, with the world around them, and how goals can either be I mean, those are some of the parameters that I'm thinking about in there. Like, how expressive is it? Like in dance is very expressive, but unless you're dancing like with constraints of tables and chairs or something like that, you're not encountering the materiality of that space in the same way as you are in parkour, which is like this blend of expressiveness and interaction with the material in this sort of like flow oriented way, or versus canoeing, you know, where maybe things going wrong is, I don't know, I'm not sure. So like, what are some of the ways that you guys are thinking about like this as an activity?
I think about sailing as, I think about Nemirovsky's ideas about knowing with a tool. So learning to sail is not, I think a lot of these activities, you can talk about them as overcoming the obstacles that are presented to you by the physical environment, whereas sailing is very much learning to be with and work with whatever you have, whether it's wind, water, or the boats themselves.
I think it's a really good question, and I hate thinking about that context too. When it comes to canoeing or dance or any of these activities we've mentioned, how it sounds super corny, but it's often more than that activity, right? Like in this canoeing activity, there's so much other stuff that happens outside of canoeing. And this club, this organization, as we kind of talked about at a program level, kind of scaffolds or structure possibilities for other types of activities. And so much of that, I guess for these communities, how much of time and place and space is afforded to everything else, right? And so like I'd be really curious in Lauren's case, right? Like with dancers, right? It's more than just doing the choreography and dancing. What are the other activities that kind of surround that central activity, and how does the central activity of dance support these other possibilities or ideas of self in this case? I mean, with this canoeing club, you can just imagine it's a bunch of environmental science nerds hanging out together, and it just opens up the floor for so many other types of work, from catching eels to doing citizen science to birding. It just, and I think it, again, on the idea of like over planning, I think we kind of lose by centering these activities so much, we kind of lose everything else in that experience. So it's things that I've been thinking about.
Yeah, that feels right to me too. Just from like rock climbing experience with a bunch of like physics nerds is what it was at the time. And this planning, like looking at a route and planning what, like, or like a bouldering problem or something, and like thinking about what you wanted to do was like 80% just social. And people had different styles of doing things too. So it was just kind of about, you know, articulating a style and thinking about like imagining how you're going to do something. But I think that social sort of component is maybe the primary activity. And then this thing about getting up a rock is like maybe actually secondary.
Right. I wanted to raise just one thing that I think is important and that we may be forgetting. And that is, so we all have these pretty well-defined contexts of planning in our minds, but I think that one of the coolest contexts to study planning is to look at planning as it emerges in the ongoing work of people, right? To some extent, our canoeing thing is kind of like that. The canoeing team wasn't into canoeing rapids. It was just part of their job, right? So they had to, you know, because they roamed, they were doing actually citizen science and collecting water quality data. And then canoeing rapids and planning for rapids was something that emerged as a necessity as part of that job, right? I think it's important to put this one more parameter, like Lisa was saying, right, into the equation, and then the context that I find really amazing are like, I have twin daughters, and I can hear them every once in a while. They have something going on, and then, you know, they decided there's this new activity, and they say, oh, let's plan for it. And then a list comes up or something like that. I'm like, oh, huh. So people have these ongoing needs to plan stuff, and they actively get together to do it, but we don't know anything much about it. We do have ideas about what, you know, these organized contexts of planning, but I find it fascinating, you know, again, given the people that raised me in this field, taught me to think about, like, this stuff is really rich and we know very little about it. Like, again, right, when is it that kids stop in the middle of a lesson to really plan something, and they really think that, oh, that planning that they told us to do, that wasn't very important, but this planning that we're doing now is really cool. right? Those are the things that I'm really interested in.
All right, I think I'm gonna call time just so you don't feel socially awkward about staying longer. But thank you all for sharing this experience. Since it's recorded, I'll probably do very light editing and upload it on YouTube, and I'll tweet out that link and that information. It'll also be, I'll put that information on the final conference proceeding thing on Xordo. But thanks again. It was nice meeting all of you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. This was a great talk.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for attending.
Yes, thank you all. It was
Ready.
really interesting.
Nice meeting you all.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.